Yeah, so this is kind of my favorite truth. I mean, you shouldn't have favorites when it comes to noble truths, but this is kind of my favorite truth. Um, Mostly because it represents kind of the inflection point in the trajectory of the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth, as we know, is the truth of suffering. The fact that suffering is not a problem, that it's a feature. It's not a glitch in the matrix. It's actually just how things go. The second noble truth being the origin or the cause of said suffering, which, as we know, is craving or desire or clinging or grasping, attachment, all the different ways that craving or clinging can happen. And I think those first two noble truths is kind of why sometimes people think Buddhists are kind of a negative lot. It's because we just like focus on suffering or life is suffering. You hear all of that stuff. Um, you know, but the second noble truth is kind of like where that ends, right? And as we transition into the third noble truth, this is where the inflection point. It's almost like the first two noble truths could be thought of as the bad news, if you want to call it that. And the third and fourth noble truth could be thought of as the good news. I don't actually think the first noble truth is necessarily bad news, by the way. I think the fact that it's not my fault is good news, but we can stick with it kind of being bad news. But when we get to this third noble truth, which is the truth of the cessation of suffering, that it is the cessation of this desire through its complete and utter rejection, abandonment, giving up, and non association. So, this notion that suffering is caused by clinging, this suffering is caused by craving. The word we use typically is tanha, right? Which I guess directly translates as thirst. And that suffering is caused by thirsting for sense pleasures, thirsting for becoming, for things to be a certain way, for us to be a certain way, and thirsting for non-becoming, for things to stop being a certain way, for things to come to an end. The good news is that if we can figure out ways to not thirst for sense pleasures, not thirst for becoming, and not thirst for non-becoming, we might not suffer. And so essentially, it's just a reverse of the second noble truth. If the second noble truth is the cause of suffering is this thirst, this craving, then this is saying, well, the cause of the end of suffering is non-thirst, non-craving. And so it's simple, right? It's a reverse of the causal chain that's mentioned in the second noble truth. But I think, and this is something Jeff may have mentioned in one of our group chats, I think he was talking about having had discussions about how this is interpreted, the third noble truth. And I think a lot of people interpret the end of suffering as if it were in capital letters, like the capital T, end capital E of suffering capital S, right? And I think that notion is built into it. The end of suffering, right? Final end of suffering, nibbana, nirvana, final awakening. Like that notion, I think, is absolutely built into this third noble truth. The idea that somehow, some way, we might crave nothing. Somehow, some way, we might cling to nothing, have attachments to nothing, that we might grasp at nothing ever. Sure, I suppose that's built into it, and that might be an end goal. But if we think of the noble truth as the third noble truth as only describing this final end of suffering, it sounds a little daunting. It doesn't exactly sound accessible, and it definitely sounds like something I could put off till a future lifetime, right? In the sense of like I don't know if this is going to happen this time around, right? But I don't necessarily think the third noble truth is saying just that. I think it's also pointing towards lowercase sufferings, lowercase n's. And so it might also be thought of as like the gradual piecemeal relinquishing of individual cravings, of individual attachments. And, it's when I think of it this way, I like to, I invite myself to just think of anything in our life. The first thing that comes to mind for me is like alcohol or drugs, but like anything in our life that we may have let go of once and tasted the freedom that followed. It doesn't have to be something as dramatic as alcohol or drugs. There could be something that we've clung to in the past that when we finally let go, we noticed a certain degree of freedom on the other side. And like, this is the type of end of suffering that I think the third noble truth points to for those of us on the path towards awakening. I don't think it's one of these things where we suffer intensely as long as we practice, and then one day we have a final awakening where we suffer not at all, right? I think it's a gradual path, a gradual path of increasingly less suffering, which means we are increasingly craving less. We are increasingly clinging to less. And some of the invitation in the meditation towards the end, in noticing when the mind is wandering and then coming back from, say, a distraction or wherever our mind went, is it's typically in that moment of mindfulness when we come back to the present moment that we have the most clarity of mindfulness. And that tends to be the moment when, however briefly, we may have cut some moment of clinging or craving, some kind of causal chain towards suffering. You know, the monk Ajahn Brahm, and I know this rubs people the wrong way sometimes when he says it, but the monk Ajahn Brahm basically says, if you sit down to meditate and you tell yourself that you're not going to get distracted, that you're just going to focus on your breath, that means that every time you got distracted, that was clinging. Everything you went towards, everything you moved towards, it was the mind reaching out and grasping for it, right? And so we can think of like even our meditation practice as every time we come back to the present moment, we're to a certain extent relinquishing some clinging, craving, attachment, something that kind of like snagged the mind in some way. Now, are these clingings and cravings that we might pick back up? Absolutely, right? And so I think there's all these stages. There's clingings or cravings that we can let go of that we pick back up later. And then we have to let go of again that we pick back up later. I do this with Doritos all the time. I'm done. I pick you back up. I'm done. I pick you back up. And then there's probably like some of these smaller versions of cravings that we can let go of that maybe we do eventually relinquish them for good, right? We're not talking about final awakening here, but we're talking about maybe there's some times, whether it's people, whether it's relationships, whether it's ideals about ourself, there might be some things that we've been attached to in the past that something happened in life where we gained enough wisdom to realize that maybe it wasn't worth clinging to that anymore. And we might now experience freedom from those things. And don't worry, we have plenty of other ways that we suffer. And so we're still not awakened, but we have gradually moved in the direction of relinquishing or letting go of some of our graspings. I think some people don't like this idea of like abandoning craving or abandoning like relinquishing or renouncing certain things. Those are kind of words that have like a negative connotation. And some folks don't even like the idea or the phrase letting go. And I think letting go is used a lot because it implies the opposite of clinging, right? It implies the opposite of grasping. And then there's that whole metaphor that as we know, as at least if we're Buddhist practitioners and we kind of have adopted some of its philosophy, we tend to agree with the fact that things are impermanent, that things change, that they're not ultimately in our control, which means that whenever we hold on to something, we're going to get rope burns, right? And that is our suffering. And so letting go kind of makes sense if you think of all of our suffering being like an inevitable loss to the tug of war of life, right? We're always going to get rope burns. But maybe letting be is another way of framing relinquishing here. There's things that we might notice the mind wanting to get involved with. You know, whether it's seeing your partner doing something in the house a particular way, and my mind thinks like maybe that could be done a little bit better or a little bit different, and I could totally interject my opinion here, but maybe I'll just let it be. Like these are ways of also working with this, like recognizing when the mind wants to like move out and adjust and turn the dials of experience, and realizing that, nah, I don't need to do this. Ajahn Chah said that if you let go a little, you will have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you'll have a lot of peace. If you let go completely, you will know complete peace and freedom. And then your struggle with the world will have come to an end. And so I think when we talk about this third noble truth, I think it's useful to think of to consider like kind of the end game. I think it's useful to consider something like final awakening as maybe the ideal. But I think it's best for us as like everyday practitioners to consider the ways that we find freedom regularly. Consider the ways that we might relinquish regularly in regular everyday life in small bite-sized morsels. And in this sense, it's hopeful. And back to this notion of the transition from the second noble truth to the third noble truth being kind of like an inflection point. I feel like for me personally, like the first, I want to say the first 10 years of my practice were definitely first and second noble truth practice. Like for me, it was just my life is suffering. Everything sucks. The Buddha was so right. Everything sucks. I'm totally craving. All of my suffering is because I craved. And I think a lot of people may go through that door and follow that path in the very beginning of practice. I mean, ultimately, did we come here in the first place because of suffering? Probably. Was our suffering, all of our individual sufferings, different? Probably. But I don't think if our lives were going well and if our lives, everything was perfect and there wasn't some subtle sense of dissatisfaction, we would ever have sought a path to do anything different in the first place, right? And so the entry point is typically suffering. But I know that roughly 10, 12 years into my practice, I feel like my practice became less about suffering and more about joy and more about freedom and more about like what we would think of as the positive qualities of mind that come following some degree of letting go, following some degree of mitigated suffering. And so if I was to characterize it like in simple fashion, I feel like my first 10 years of practice was like dukkha or suffering aversive. I was kind of like running from suffering. And I think ever since it's been running to joy, running to contentment, running to peace. Not that I don't suffer anymore, but my focus has been more on trying to notice the qualities that arise when suffering has ceased. And that's kind of what the invitation was with the meditation there. Like, what is the mind like when we come back? Sometimes, when we do, I'm not sure how many folks in here have worked with like the hindrances when they practice, the hindrances of essentially greed, aversion, restlessness, worry, sloth, torpor, sleepiness, doubt, all the things that kind of prevent us from being present and content in any given moment. Sometimes when we work with those in meditation, it can become like a very negative kind of meditation because all we're doing is kind of playing whack-a-mole with all the things that are wrong with our mind. And the invitation when it comes to like the third noble truth then is to, instead of playing whack-a-mole with all the negative stuff that keeps coming up, what if we played like whack-a-mole, or not even whack-a-mole? What if we just brought our attention instead to the space between those negative things when they arise? What if we bring attention to the space between the distractions rather than the distraction itself? What if we bring attention to the space between anger and clinging and craving and dissatisfaction instead to the peace that likely exists when those things aren't present? And I think that's what this third noble truth is pointing towards. And so in that sense, it's hope, right? In that sense, it points in the direction of what life might be like, where there's more freedom, where there's more contentment, and where there's more joy. And there's, of course, more I could say, but I'm not going to do that today. I do want to hear from folks in the room and give us all a little bit of space to share either about your practice today, about what you think of the third noble truth, or anything else that might be coming up for you. So thank you.